When
Thank
are
you
you
for having me.
expecting us to have a final outcome of the election?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I'll tell you what I'm not expecting, which is I'm not expecting an answer on Tuesday night. And I know that this disappoints a lot of people, but I really want people around the world to know if anybody claims victory on election night, be very, very careful about whether or not we can believe that. There are a number of states now where obviously we're spending so much more time voting by mail. Those ballots take a lot more time to count. Some states don't even allow people to start counting until the day before election day or election day. We could be looking at more like a week, and that's suggesting that we wouldn't have some big legal battles dragging on.
Let's talk a little bit about those legal battles, because we are seeing more Republicans challenging ballots one by one, even in some cases seeking to really get rid of votes that have already been cast. What can we expect on that front, and who would be the final arbiter of what happens on this front?
Yeah, what we can expect right now is more of the same. We can expect, I mean, the pattern, as you said, is really the GOP suggesting that we need stricter laws when it comes to voting, and that we should invalidate more votes. The Democratic Party arguing essentially the opposite, that we should have looser laws, particularly during a pandemic, and that we should be very, very careful about not throwing out votes. Now, what should we expect after the election? It kind of depends, and I know everybody hates this answer. If it's close, then there will be a battle to the death in those swing states. There will be heavy litigation about which votes should be counted, which votes should be invalidated. You're going to hear headlines from America like, if you didn't put your ballot in the proper envelope, are we going to throw at tens of thousands of ballots in, for instance, Pennsylvania? You ask me who could ultimately decide this. It could go to the Supreme Court. I don't think the chances are very high, but it is within the realm of possible for sure.
Jessica, I was just going to ask as a follow-up, how does the makeup now of the Supreme Court impact all this? How does the fact that Amy Coney Barrett has been appointed and confirmed weigh into this at the highest levels?
Well, I mean, I think the conventional wisdom is that she is a very conservative justice. And so the U.S. Supreme Court now is 6-3, very conservative members who are appointed by Republican presidents. But we don't know, and I know this might sound naive, we don't know the specific legal question that's going to come before the court, if there is one. We don't know the facts that will come before the court. And certainly President Trump has said very openly, you know, I want Judge Barrett to become Justice Barrett because I want her there for election litigation. But I don't think it's a done deal that everybody votes according to the party affiliation of the president who appointed them. You can imagine a situation where Judge Barrett doesn't want to be, for the rest of her career on the Supreme Court, which could be 40 years, questioned about her independence because it looks like President Trump said, here's your job, and she said, thank you, and here's your job.
It's really interesting looking at this from outside of the US, right? Pretty extraordinary and not for the right reasons when you take a look at just how complicated, confusing and downright difficult the electoral process is for the world's biggest democracy. What are the chances, the likelihood of reforms happening, depending on what the outcome of this week really is?
I wish that I could say they're high. I remember when we had Bush versus Gore, which is 20 years ago now. I was a student at university, and I thought, okay, now we're finally going to invest in election infrastructure the way we should. But the truth is, in America, we don't have national election standards. We have a patchwork. We have 50 different standards from 50 different states. And we have old voting machines. We have antiquated rules that mostly don't make that much difference because voting isn't that tight. But now we have a perfect storm. More people voting by mail. Total lack of education when it comes to voting by mail because most people just go to the polls, but they're not going to do that in the middle of a pandemic. So, but having said all that, do I expect we're going to invest in election infrastructure? Do I expect that we're going to have reform? I don't, because if the past is prologue, we tend to care a lot in America about elections sometime around kind of Halloween to the week after the election, and then we basically forget about it.
We had a Forex analyst just earlier today, and he talked about a rally in the dollar coming because he believes in the strength of American institutions. What is your take on that front? Because what I've seen in the last few years of this administration is what's happened to the erosion of institutional strength. Just take a look at the DOJ.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you. And this is going to sound like a partisan comment, but it's not meant to be, which is I don't think America will look like America if President Trump is elected for 4 more years. I think that the guardrails simply can't hold. So there are so many kind of institutional strengths that people talk about, but the American Constitution essentially assumes that people are going to lie a little bit. That's why we have the system of checks and balances. We have 3 different co-equal branches. The American system basically assumes that people will try and take too much power, but it doesn't assume that every branch will fail. And unfortunately, based on the last almost 4 years, I don't think that we can depend on, at this point, the Senate. I don't think because it's been completely remade, we can depend on the judiciary. And at that point, we have a President Trump who is not worried about running for re-election and who is far less constrained. This has nothing to do with policy differences. This has to do with my fear that the rule of law is eroded and that our institutional weakness is just laid bare. I don't see, this republic, quote, if you can keep it, really surviving in a recognizable state if President Trump is reelected.
What's happened over the past 4 years, though, seems to be a solidifying, a cementing of a conservative-leaning judiciary. Am I correct in that? And what happens if you do get Biden in the White House, if you get the Democrats in a blue sweep? Would this conservative-leaning judiciary hamper some policy making? We have already seen this year the courts strike down executive orders and laws.
Such a good question, such an important question. President Trump has been so enormously efficient and effective at remaking the federal judiciary. As you know, these judges are appointed for life, so they're not going to leave with President Trump. They will be there for 30, 40, sometimes maybe even 50 years. And so, it could be that Vice President Biden becomes President Biden, but there's still, these laws will be challenged, and the federal judiciary will play a very large role. Could Vice President Biden just remake the federal judiciary like President Trump did? Probably not, because President Trump filled so many of the vacancies. And I think that's part of the reason, actually, to what we were talking about before. I think that's part of the reason that Senate Republicans stayed with him, because they were so efficient at remaking the judicial branch, the federal judiciary. So, if you are a conservative in terms of judicial thought, this is great news. If you are in the center or left of center, this is troubling because the Supreme Court will be conservative, likely at least for a generation.